The quiet hum of whispering voices in the Atlanta courtroom seemed deafening against the silence of the woman standing in front of the judge's bench. At 45, her stillness had an unusual gravity. She wore a simple gray coat buttoned to the throat, the fabric slightly frayed around the cuffs. In stark contrast to the expensive suits and polished shoes around her, she looked out of place, a silent, vulnerable figure, dwarfed by the authority and wealth represented in the room. Yet her eyes, fixed on the floor, conveyed neither fear nor surrender, but an unshakable resolve. Judge Albert Montgomery, aged, stern-faced, and proud, leaned forward in his chair, peering down at her as if she were an unpleasant distraction. He sighed dramatically, shaking his head with a patronizing expression. "Ma'am, you realize the seriousness of the accusations against you, don't you?" She raised her gaze slowly, her calm eyes meeting his. "Yes, Your Honor." "And yet you insist," Judge Montgomery continued, leaning back slightly, "that this wasn't aggressive assault? You struck an officer of the law, on private property no less." A hush rippled through the audience. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering over notebooks. The prosecutor, a tall man with perfectly coiffed hair and a self-assured smirk, adjusted his tie, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "I intervened because an unarmed teenager was being beaten by the security officer," she answered evenly. "I acted in defense of someone who was unable to defend himself." Judge Montgomery snorted dismissively. "You assaulted an authority figure. This isn't the place to argue self-defense, miss." "General," she quietly corrected him, her voice steady, low, and laced with quiet confidence. Montgomery paused, a skeptical laugh breaking from his lips, as murmurs and chuckles filled the courtroom. "General?" he repeated incredulously. "Oh, forgive me. General." His sarcasm was biting, a veiled insult that elicited more subdued laughter. "Regardless, your badge and any rank you may imagine yourself holding won't excuse assault. Hand it over." Her gaze never faltered as she reached calmly into her plain, worn bag. Silence gradually returned. Curiosity peaked as people strained their necks to catch a glimpse of what she was doing. From her bag, she gently drew a leather-bound folder and placed it reverently on the table before her. The prosecutor's smile faltered slightly, confusion flickering in his eyes. Montgomery, impatient now, snapped, "This is not the time for theatrics! Hand over your badge!" The woman opened the folder, placing carefully each object upon the table. First, a gleaming military Order of Honor medal, its blue ribbon vibrant against the worn wooden surface. Then, photographs, old but clear, of her standing proudly in uniform, surrounded by soldiers in foreign lands. Another photograph showed her shaking hands firmly with a former president of the United States, both faces serious, respectful. Lastly, a letter embossed with the emblem of the White House. The courtroom went absolutely silent. It was as though she had released some spell into the air, binding everyone in a moment of astonishment. The arrogance that had colored Judge Montgomery's face began to fade into uncertainty. He adjusted his glasses, peering incredulously at the items before him. "Your Honor," came a nervous voice, the prosecutor now glancing between the woman and the judge uncertainly. "This seems irrelevant. The charges clearly state assault." Before Montgomery could reply, the woman spoke quietly, yet her voice carried powerfully through the silence. "Permission to address the court?" Judge Montgomery hesitated, then, visibly shaken by the unfolding reality, nodded curtly. "My name is General Candace Miller," she began, her voice soft but steady, each word precisely measured, resonating with quiet dignity. "I have served my country for over 25 years. Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia. In each place, I stood not only for America, but for justice, for human dignity. 3 combat deployments. I've commanded hundreds, saved lives, and lost friends. Awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor. Served as a professor at West Point, teaching future officers what it means to serve with honor. Every word dropped heavily, her gaze unwavering, fierce yet composed. And yesterday, in a supermarket, I stood again for justice, as I've done my entire life. When I saw an unarmed, frightened boy held down and beaten unjustly, I intervened, as anyone with honor should. The security guard you claim I attacked was twice my size. But courage isn't defined by stature or strength. It's defined by choosing what's right, even when everyone else is silent. The stillness in the courtroom felt tangible. Judge Montgomery looked shaken, speechless for perhaps the first time in his career. The prosecutor's expression shifted into something between shock and dread, the arrogance gone completely. The doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open softly, drawing everyone's attention. A thin figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, pulling off his hood, the same teenager she'd defended. His voice was quiet but clear as he spoke, looking directly at General Miller. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for defending me when no one else did." The tension broke then, replaced by a quiet, profound realization spreading through the courtroom. People rose slowly to their feet. Reporters, lawyers, even security personnel. And one by one, they began to clap. A slow ripple of sound turned into a deafening, sustained applause. Judge Montgomery, visibly shaken, reached for his glass of water, hands trembling. This is highly irregular," he stammered. I need to review this further. Court is adjourned." But General Miller didn't move, eyes steady on the judge as he hurriedly rose from his seat. She stood alone, tall and unwavering amidst a tide of newfound respect and astonishment. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward her as she exited, silent, dignified, and unstoppable. The woman they'd underestimated, mocked, and dismissed had in one calm, deliberate act of courage shown them all the true measure of strength, and the courtroom would never forget her name. General Candace Miller. Outside the courthouse, a frenzy of camera flashes and shouted questions flooded Candace Miller's senses, an abrupt shift from the solemnity of the courtroom. Reporters surrounded her, pressing microphones forward aggressively. "Juan, General Miller, what do you say to those who accuse you of violence? Do you think you were targeted because of your race? General, will you press charges against the guard who attacked the boy?" Her expression remained serene, unyielding as she walked toward a waiting car, deliberately ignoring the provocative shouts around her. She'd learned long ago, amidst the dust and danger of foreign deserts, that dignity and silence were more powerful than any reaction. As the vehicle door closed behind her, the noise softened. Miller exhaled slowly, her shoulders straight, her eyes distant. Yet, even in silence, her mind raced. She knew exactly how the next few hours would unfold. Moments later, her phone vibrated. The screen flashed Colonel Isaac Hayes. She tapped accept, expecting the familiar, steady voice of her longtime friend and fellow officer. "Candace," Isaac said, tension thickening his voice. "They're making you the villain. Every news channel. That guard's lawyer was just on air, accusing you of assault. They're painting him as the victim." She leaned back, pinching the bridge of her nose with closed eyes. "I expected nothing less." "They'll come after you hard," Isaac warned quietly. "You've embarrassed powerful people." Miller sighed, remembering the faces she'd seen in the courtroom. men who valued their pride and status above truth and justice. They can try. Her calm resolve unsettled Isaac slightly. Are you sure about this, Candace? They won't play fair. She opened her eyes, gazing through the tinted windows. I've never been more certain. The following morning, Candace Miller's quiet street transformed overnight into a battleground of media vans and protesters. Stepping out onto her porch, dressed plainly in civilian clothing, she felt their hostility. Signs waved accusingly. Violent general must go. Assault is assault. Rank doesn't excuse. Camera shutters clicked aggressively as reporters shouted questions, but Miller's gaze settled on one figure near the back of the crowd, a teenager watching silently, hood down, eyes solemn. The boy from the supermarket. She descended the porch steps, the mob parting hesitantly before her dignified stride. She walked straight to him, ignoring the barrage of cameras and questions. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Elijah," he answered, voice low, uncertain. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, conscious of countless eyes watching their interaction. "I had to," Elijah whispered. "You stood up for me. No one ever does that." His eyes brimmed with unshed tears. Miller reached out, gently placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Always stand for what's right, Elijah, even if you stand alone." The gesture was brief, but the media devoured it instantly, reframing the narrative, at least momentarily. Inside her home, Miller turned on the television, unable to escape the rising intensity of her predicament. A popular talk show was featuring Judge Montgomery himself, looking authoritative yet clearly agitated. "The general," he said sternly, "might feel justified, but America is a nation of laws. Violence isn't an acceptable response. The law will not be mocked." Miller switched off the television abruptly. A sudden pounding on her door startled her. Opening it cautiously, she found Colonel Isaac Hayes, tall, severe, but deeply loyal. "Candace, we have to talk," he insisted urgently. She stepped aside to allow him entry. Once inside, Hayes looked her in the eyes, concern etched on his face. "I just got a call from West Point. They've suspended your teaching position pending investigation." She felt the blow, but refused to show weakness. "What else?" He hesitated briefly. "Your security clearance is being reviewed. They're putting pressure on everyone connected to you." The air around her seemed suddenly thinner. Her life's work, her medals, rank, years of sacrifice, were being systematically dismantled. She closed her eyes for just a moment, drawing on the deep reserves of strength that had carried her through wars and conflicts abroad. "They're trying to break me," she whispered softly, "but they have no idea how far I'll go to defend justice." Hayes looked away, struggling for words. "Candace, you have nothing left to prove. You've given everything for this country." She stepped forward, eyes blazing now with controlled fire. "That boy Elijah, he represents everything I fought to protect, everything I still fight to protect. I won't let them silence me, Isaac." The colonel stared at her, recognizing the steel in her voice, the same steel that had led soldiers through firefights, insurgencies, and chaos. He nodded slowly, a quiet reverence in his expression. "You've always been the strongest of us, Candace," he said quietly. "But be careful. They're scared of what you represent." Her phone rang again. This time the caller ID read State Attorney General's Office. Hayes watched anxiously as she answered. The conversation was brief, coldly formal. Hanging up, she met his questioning gaze. "They're charging me formally. Court date in 3 days. Hayes exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. It's escalating faster than we thought. They're setting an example out of you. She stepped towards the window, looking outside at the crowd still gathered, feeling the weight of expectations, the scrutiny of a nation. They're right, Isaac. They should set an example, because I'll show everyone exactly what justice looks like. That night, as the crowd dispersed, Elijah remained alone on the curb. Miller approached quietly, jacket wrapped around her shoulders. "You should go home, Elijah," she said gently. He looked up at her, vulnerability and strength intertwined in his gaze. "I don't have a home, ma'am. I've been bouncing foster homes for months. No one ever believes me." She stood still, stunned for a moment. "Where will you go tonight?" He shrugged helplessly. "Don't know." She felt a sudden, fierce resolve swell in her chest. "Come inside. I'll fix you something to eat, and we'll find a place for you." Elijah hesitated, eyes widening. "But they've accused you of so much. Won't this make it worse?" She knelt before him, holding his gaze steadily. "Doing what's right doesn't need permission, Elijah. Come inside." As they walked into her home together, cameras from afar captured every moment. But Candace Miller no longer cared. She understood fully what was at stake now. It was never just about her. It was about Elijah, about every innocent person lost in a system that favored power over justice. Inside the warmth of her kitchen, Miller looked at the young boy, eyes full of quiet hope, trust shining despite betrayal and pain. In that moment, she knew the battle was no longer just legal, no longer abstract. It was personal, and she'd fight until the end. On the day of the trial, sunlight cut sharply through the courtroom windows, illuminating every face with an almost blinding intensity. The gallery buzzed quietly with whispers of anticipation. Media representatives, local politicians, community members, veterans in uniform, packed tightly, all eyes locked onto one woman. General Candace Miller sat at the defendant's table, calm yet intensely focused. Beside her, Elijah fidgeted nervously, looking so small, vulnerable, yet fiercely determined. Miller rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder briefly, sensing his anxiety. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Albert Montgomery," the bailiff announced, breaking the heavy silence. Judge Montgomery entered, tension apparent in his tight-lipped frown. As he took his seat, his gaze settled uneasily on Miller, a fleeting moment of genuine discomfort. The prosecutor, this time visibly tense and wary, began his opening statement cautiously. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to determine justice. No title, no past accomplishments, no medals can excuse violence." Miller listened without flinching, expression unwavering. "Thank you," Judge Montgomery said curtly. "General Miller, your response?" She stood slowly, every movement measured, deliberate, as the courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. Miller looked first to the judge, then turned to the spectators and jurors, speaking in a voice calm yet powerful. "When I intervened that day, it was not as a decorated officer or a professor, nor even as a general. I acted simply as a human being, one who saw an injustice and chose not to look away." She glanced briefly at Elijah, who met her eyes with quiet admiration. "It's true. I struck the security guard after repeatedly asking him to stop assaulting Elijah. Elijah, an innocent child, defenseless against a man far stronger. Every medal I've earned, every war I've survived, every life I've saved, I would trade it all again without hesitation to stop what happened that day." Her words hung heavily, each syllable clear, honest, and utterly unapologetic. A ripple of murmurs moved through the courtroom. The prosecutor stepped forward again, raising his voice. The defendant's record, impressive as it may be, does not absolve her. Violence is violence. Miller faced him directly. Is justice simply blind adherence to laws? Or is it about courageously doing what is morally right, even when unpopular or difficult? The room went still. The prosecutor faltered momentarily, visibly shaken. Suddenly, from the gallery, Colonel Isaac Hayes stood, medals bright on his chest. Permission to address the court? Judge Montgomery, caught off guard, hesitated, then nodded. Proceed. Hayes's voice was firm, loud, unwavering. General Miller taught us all that justice isn't convenient. It isn't easy. It demands courage. She didn't strike that guard out of malice. She acted to save a life. Another soldier stood, proudly in uniform. She saved my platoon in Iraq. We wouldn't be alive without her courage. Another rose. She defended my family when no one else would. One by one, voices rose. Veterans, civilians, former students, mothers, fathers, each telling of her integrity, her compassion, her fearless pursuit of justice. Judge Montgomery's hands shook slightly. The prosecutor's confidence evaporated into shock. The courtroom was flooded with testimony, not accusations, but affirmations of honor, integrity, courage. Miller stood silently, deeply moved, yet strong and dignified. Then Elijah stood up quietly, his youthful voice steady, clear. She defended me when everyone else watched silently. She risked everything for someone who had nothing. That's real justice. Judge Montgomery's gaze met Miller's, and for the first time, she saw genuine regret in his eyes. He slowly raised a trembling hand, requesting silence. General Miller, he said quietly, his voice tinged with humility, I apologize for my judgments, for my assumptions. Your courage speaks louder than my gavel ever could. A profound stillness enveloped the room. The judge continued, voice shaking with emotion. Charges against General Miller are dismissed immediately, and a formal inquiry will be launched into this incident and its circumstances. The courtroom erupted into emotional applause. Veterans stood at attention, saluting General Miller with solemn reverence. Reporters scrambled for footage, their previous narrative overturned completely. Yet Miller did not celebrate loudly. Instead, she turned to Elijah, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. You showed immense bravery today. I'm proud of you. He smiled through tears, whispering, You changed my life, ma'am. As they exited the courtroom together, a sea of media and supporters surrounded them. But amidst the chaos, Judge Montgomery approached them quietly. I have resigned from my position, he admitted softly, sincerity evident in his eyes. I was wrong. Miller regarded him calmly, nodding in acceptance. Real courage, she said gently, is recognizing our own flaws and choosing to change. He stepped back respectfully, silently conceding her strength and integrity. That evening, as the news echoed victory and vindication, Miller sat quietly at home, Elijah nearby, their bond now unbreakable. The doorbell rang suddenly. Opening it, she saw dozens of neighbors, families, veterans, community members, all gathered, holding candles in quiet solidarity. Colonel Hayes stepped forward. General Candace Miller, we came to honor you for reminding us all what it means to be brave. She stood there, deeply moved, as applause filled the quiet street. Elijah tugged gently on her sleeve. Did you ever think this would happen? Miller smiled softly, kneeling to face him eye to eye. Justice has a funny way of finding the truth, Elijah. It takes courage, patience, and faith, but eventually, The truth always rises. As night fell quietly around them, the street became illuminated by the glowing candles held by supporters. And standing there, amidst the warmth and quiet reverence, General Candace Miller finally felt a deep, profound peace. Justice had been served, not by force nor by rank, but by courage and truth. And the woman they once underestimated stood tall, a quiet hero for all who had been silenced, proving to everyone that the strongest voice was often the quietest. The battle had been hard, the opposition overwhelming, yet through courage, honor, and resilience, she had triumphed. Not only in a court of law, but in the eyes of a nation desperate for real justice. As Miller looked around at the faces of gratitude and respect, she felt an overwhelming truth resonate deeply. Justice is never a privilege. It is a duty, owed to every soul, especially to those who cannot fight for themselves. And as long as there was breath in her body, General Candace Miller would continue that fight, guided by honor, defined by courage, and driven by the quiet, unstoppable strength of justice.